I was here many years ago. It's a pleasure to be here again this morning. It's really fascinating that we chose this particular morning to be here today. Reason being is that in the Jewish religion, we have a scriptural reading every week. And we start from Genesis and we go through the 5 books of Moses, through the book of Deuteronomy. And this week's reading, we're 2/3 of the way through the story of Joseph. Joseph is one of the most interesting characters in the entire Bible. And whether or not the writers of the New Testament came up with the name Joseph or the father of Jesus, even Judaism doesn't accept that, I find very interesting, because Joseph is a character in the Bible like no other. God never spoke to Joseph. In the entire Bible, God speaks to people, doesn't he? And it never says, Vayomer Adonai El Yosef. It never says, and the word of the Lord came to Joseph. Joseph knew what God was going to say even before God would tell him what to do. Joseph had kind of magical powers. He was an interpreter of dreams, and he had visions of life after life, which we're going to explain today. My background is in intertestamental studies. I just turned 70 years of age, and I chose to have my 70th birthday at the Wailing Wall in Jerusalem. Because numbers and where you're at certain times in your life really matter. This is a very spiritual lecture, and I'm going to go all over the place with it. I believe that everybody has heard the word Mazel Tov before. Have you not? Most people think that Mazel Tov means good luck, but it goes to show you where the roots of Western tradition really lie, and that's where I'd like to start. The word mazel is the Hebrew word for star. It's the Hebrew word for star, a star in the sky, okay? You know that in the ancient world, people had zodiac signs, and many of you know your astrology sign. I'm a Sagittarius, so symbol of Sagittarius is fire, and Sagittarians are givers. They're caregivers, and they're healers, and they're very spiritual. According to Jewish Kabbalah, to Jewish mysticism, we all have a personality based on our zodiac sign. That's just the way it is. And contemporary Judaism believes in the existence of an afterlife with the soul. Okay? One of the things that is incredible to me, it's just simply incredible, is that we've all heard of the word philosophy. Philosophy and theology are 2 different words. If you take a major in philosophy in college, it's different than a major in theology. Philosophy involves logic, and theology involves faith. Last night I was preaching in my synagogue in Temecula, and I talked about the words that came before the parting of the Sea of Reeds when the Jews came out of Egypt. And in Judaism, truth comes before faith. So if logic tells you something different than faith, then you have to change your beliefs. You know, that kind of makes sense. But when you argue about politics or money or about religion, people are very adamant about it, and even though they were brought up with certain values that factually the evidence tells them that it might not be true, people don't want to see it. But it is no mistake that Christianity had its roots in the teachings of Philo. Philo was a teacher in ancient Egypt. There were 1 million Jews during the time of the year 0 that lived in Egypt, in Alexandria, and he was a great teacher. He was such a great teacher that there's a school of Philo that we all follow now called philosophy, which is different than theology because it involves logic. What differentiates Judaism from Christianity is that in Judaism, the soul has a separate existence outside the body. Okay, so in the ancient world, when a lot of people believed in life after life, they believed in a physical hereafter life, a place where your body or your essence would go, which would have something to do with your flesh as well as your soul. For instance, in Casper the Friendly Ghost, Casper there's some type of matter to Casper. He's just not all energy. He has something, he can walk through walls, but he has a body. Okay, in Judaism, the soul has a separate existence from the body. The reason why most Jews believe in abortion is because when a man and a woman come together sexually and a baby is created inside of a mother's womb, the soul enters separate from the conception. We don't know when, but the soul has nothing to do with the conception. So when then two cells come together between a man and a woman, it doesn't form a life. You need God there. And so the angel of birth, in Judaism as Christianity believes in angel, at some time the angel of birth enters that physical body inside the womb, and the soul is put there. Therefore, when a person dies, the soul leaves. The soul leaves the body, and it goes to heaven, and the body separates, and it returns to the earth. That's the belief in Judaism. Now, how do we know this? A lot of people have seen reenactments of President Lincoln's funeral, and you've seen them put pennies over the eye. Okay? Years ago, it was the belief that since we know that there is no blood that circulates in the center of the eye, that the soul enters the body through the eye and it leaves the body through the eye. And therefore, you go to the biblical definition of where life starts. And if you go to the creation story of Adam and Eve, life begins with the blood, and it ends with the blood. You can see this throughout the Bible. The definition of life in the blood is where life continues to stop is when there is no more blood flowing from the body. Okay? And there's a commandment in the Bible that Western tradition accepts that you cannot eat raw meat or you can't eat rare meat because you cannot drink the blood of an animal because it contains the soul. You've heard that before. So in the Bible, blood and the soul were analogous to each other. They were equated with each other. That changed in the Middle Ages. In the Middle Ages, there were a lot of people who were buried alive because they used to put a feather underneath somebody's nostrils. You know, when God breathed into Adam the breath of life, and Adam breathed, and when a baby is born and you suck out the mucus or whatever is clogged in the baby's nostrils, when the baby can breathe on its own without any machinery, the baby is considered alive. We've changed it again. In the modern age today, your life is analogous with your brain waves. If there is no brain waves or there is no mind, nothing is functioning in the mind, then you're not alive. Now, it's very interesting when we get into this world of Kabbalah and we get into what the body is, you'll notice that the head is comprised of your eye and your brain. And when you think of the most important part of your body, it usually is your brain, is usually your head, is your vision, what you see, and what you know. It's interesting that the postmodern age, as we are now in the year 2020, in the 21st century, what threatens everything that I'm going to tell you today is the idea that someday, if you can take your mind and you can put it on a chip and you can put it in somebody else's body, then that's going to change the whole definition of life, okay? You know, when we go through the philosopher who said, I think it was Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am, you know, this is what life really is. I want to show you that these words are not mine, and we'll go through them. I wrote the name Maimonides down on the board. Maimonides was a sage who was a doctor, and he was such a great man as a biblical thinker and a doctor that even during the Crusades, when the great leader Saladin became injured and the Jews were not fighting on the side of the Christians to gain access to the Holy Land, Saladin wanted Maimonides as his doctor, okay? Maimonides knew everything about the body, and he knew everything about Jewish religion, about the Bible. Perhaps one of the greatest thinkers that ever lived. He came down to the 13 attributes of God. I don't want to analyze all of the attributes about God, but I want to tell you that this is what we know about God. And it's very interesting because as we go through them, as we go through these attributes, you will notice that the first few are not controversial. We all probably can agree with them. Maybe we can raise our hands. But when you get down to the last three, I personally don't agree with them. And then we're going to go through the reason why, okay? So the first one is that God is eternal. God lives forever. Does everybody accept that? Yes. Okay. The interesting thing, I was mentioning to a gentleman before we started, that if you are an atheist or agnostic, you realize that you totally deny that there's a spiritual world. I just don't understand how anybody could be an atheist or an agnostic, because everything then exists on what you can prove physically. Anything that you think that is not tangential, right, does not exist. For instance, even before I get to the 13 attributes of Maimonides, I don't know how many of you had a dream last night, okay? Whatever you dreamt last night, it really doesn't matter. Joseph, as I said, was a dreamer. You can't tell me that your mind was aware that it was inside your body when it was dreaming. Your mind was somewhere else when it was dreaming, when it was not inside your body. So you had an event that was a non-physical event last night within your body. So there has to be something more to life than just you. Okay, so when we go back to Maimonides, the first belief that Maimonides is that God is eternal, meaning that God was, God is, and God will ever be. Okay? The second thing is that there's only one God. Okay, God isn't Jewish, God isn't Buddhist, God isn't Christian, God simply is God. The third is that God has no body. Okay, that's why I'm saying these become a little more controversial as we go on. Number 4 is, and I'm reading this now, so I'm not making this up, God created the universe. Okay? Number 5, God has to be worshipped. Number 6, God revealed the Bible to man and to the prophets. Number 7 is that Moses was the greatest prophet. Number 8 is that the 5 books of Moses is true. Number 9 is the 5 books of Moses is non-questionable. 10, and these become more controversial as we go on, God knows our thoughts and he knows what the future allows. Okay? I agree with all of those 10. What I do not agree with, and this gets to the belief in the soul and what people, if you don't believe in the existence of the soul by itself, then you believe in something else. So number 11 is God rewards those who obey the commandments and punishes those who don't. Meaning that if you have a good person in life, that eventually that person is going to be rewarded, and if you have a bad person in life, that God is going to punish them. Obviously, that doesn't work in this life. We see a lot of people who are evil, and the definition of evil is a person who gets pleasure in hurting innocent people. To me, that's the definition of what evil is. So I personally don't see this, that God always rewards the righteous and he punishes the wicked. Number 12 is the belief in that the Messiah will someday come, which I'll go into later as well. And number 13 is that God grants eternal life in paradise somewhere, or in heaven, okay? Now, a lot of Jews still believe in those, but what I'm saying is that the first 10 are non-questionable. I think that we can go along and say, you know, we can believe in those, but the 3 that become questionable is that God rewards the righteous and punishes the wicked. 12 is a belief in the Messiah, and 13 is that God grants eternal life in some type of paradise, which would imply that you're rewarded for your good life here on earth. Okay, now, what does Philo have to say about that? If we go back to the Bible, when somebody died, they were simply gathered with their fathers. The only instance in the entire Bible, I'm saying in the Old Testament, of any type of life after death is that when Samuel the prophet dies, Saul goes to a witch. Witches appear in the Bible. And the witch looks into her crystal ball, into her looking glass, and conjures up the spirit of Samuel. And Samuel talks to Saul and says, I can't talk to you. I'm in a place right now where the dead don't talk to the living. Therefore, this is forbidden. Go away. I'm not going to talk anymore, and vanishes. So witches are in the Bible. Crystal balls are in the Bible. This is the only proof of life after death that we have in the entire Bible, except with the amazing story about Joseph in the Bible, which is I really even can't comment on, but which we read this morning in the synagogue, and it's very appropriate that I'm here. I mean, we have 56 Torah portions, and of all the 56 weeks that I could be here, I'm here on the Saturday, the one day of the year where we read the Bible. And if I wasn't here, I'd be in the synagogue reading from the scripture. So the story is that we're at the end of Genesis, and you have to understand that Joseph was not frustrated by his life. You have to understand that Joseph is such a mystical character that you can't get out of the hospital without receiving a name, can you? All right? Joseph doesn't have a name. Jacob, his father, had 10 sons and 1 daughter, and when another son was born, he said, oh, it's another one. We'll call him another one. So he doesn't have a name. Oh, another one just entered the room, okay? He doesn't have a name. Joseph really was sold into slavery by his brothers. He spends 20 years in prison. He never complains. And then he has to live his entire life as an Egyptian. He marries an Egyptian. And then even when his family comes down to Egypt to be restored to him, he can't leave the palace. He has to live his life as an Egyptian because he's ruling there. And if he would leave the throne and his father-in-law, Pharaoh, he would be like the Jews, or like the Hebrews at that time. But he has to be in the palace. And then he has no hate against his brothers at all for what they did to him. So he has one dying wish, okay? His one dying wish is that when he dies someday, that his remains be taken to Israel, back to the Holy Land. This is what we cannot explain, okay? And you have to understand this becomes very mystical, okay? And I didn't put this up on the board, and I'm getting goosebumps when I tell you this. I'm telling you that the Bible could not have been written by man. There's so many things in there. You have a document that is so perfect that no man could write it by himself. And the Jews were the most primitive of all people. So and nobody ever claimed that they stole it from anybody, right? It's just impossible that somebody could have written this. Everything in the story of Genesis has a counterpart, right? So in the Garden of Eden, there are 2 trees. There's the tree of life, right? And then there's the tree of knowledge of good and bad, or knowledge of good and evil. So you see the counterpart. If there was a tree of life in the Garden of Eden, there had to be a tree of death. Well, the word for tree of death in Hebrew, which is atzmut, it's not on the board, it means your skeleton, your bones. It means because that's the tree of death. When you die, the only thing that remains are your bones, right? So he says, I want you to bring the bones of Joseph that they be buried in the land of Israel, okay? And here's where the Bible is like so beautiful. In the Bible, and I don't know how many people have visited Israel, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob were buried in the cave of Machpelah. That's where they were buried. You would think that Joseph would be there as well, because Joseph is the bridge between Moses and the other patriarchs. But because Joseph didn't live a Jewish life, he lived his life as an Egyptian, he's not buried in the cave of Machpelah. He's buried in his separate tomb. And in the Jewish faith, it's impossible. If this were a synagogue that you had somebody was dead, you can't take the dead and place them before people, okay? Even in the New Testament, they write the life of Jesus as a Jew, that they know that the Messiah could have no contact with the dead, because the dead are considered unclean. So what the Arabs did is, because the Messiah is supposed to go through a certain gate in there, the Golden Gate, they closed it up and they built a cemetery so that the Jewish and the Christian Messiah could never come back to Jerusalem. And even today, you can't enter that gate. And as I said, they put a cemetery there. So he says, I want you to carry the bones of Joseph next to the Ark of the Covenant, this is the ark that was given to the Jewish people to put the original 10 Commandments. How could anybody put and carry the bones of Joseph next to the ark? It doesn't make any sense. Now the Jews get to the Jordan River, and they get to the place where they're going to bury Joseph, and they name the place Gilgal, which is the Hebrew word for resurrection. The word resurrection actually means wheel. And it means that, the wheel goes, the circle of life, you come around. So if matter cannot be destroyed, if matter always exists, then it's got to go somewhere. The soul has to go somewhere, okay? Now here's where Einstein, as a Jew, took his theory of relativity from, okay? You have to understand another amazing thing. Einstein, Freud, and Marx all lived in Vienna during the German and Nazi regime in the 1930s, but they never met each other because they weren't religious. And they weren't religious all for the same reason. And we even have that problem today. There are a lot of Jewish people who do not believe in a personal God. They don't believe that God is your butler, and that if you pray to God, then God is going to give you something automatically because you pray to him. They believe in an impersonal God, of a creator, that God has a separate plan for you and for the universe, and no matter how you try, you're not going to affect that plan. So Freud, Einstein, and Marx, somewhere in their own theology, said, if God isn't going to do for me, I'm not going to do for God, and they didn't support the Jewish community. But they thought like Jews. Now, it took 20 years for Einstein to come up with his theory of relativity, which had to do in the basis of a theological plane which is different than his. If we follow Philo, that life is energy, okay? That's the one thing that you have to understand, that there's an energy inside of the universe, and a black hole is antimatter. So remember I told you everything has an opposite? So if God is associated with light, then black or darkness is associated with antimatter. Okay? Now, going back to the definition of what life is. In Judaism, Jews do not believe in the devil or they don't believe in hell. So if you believe in this reward and punishment idea, and you had a bad person who is not going to go into an afterlife, where does his soul go? You know, it goes back to what, you ever see Superman in the Phantom Zone? Okay? You kind of go in a place where it's like time out, and you never get out of there. Okay? Now, if that's what the Catholics define as purgatory, I don't know. But the interesting thing is, the predecessor of the belief in the Messiah is the prophet Elijah. And that story is totally misinterpreted. Elijah did not perform God's will. And after Elijah did something great for God, and he got rid of Jezebel and King Ahab, and he had this whole thing where he got rid of idol worship on Mount Carmel in northern Israel, he goes to God and he says, you've been asking me to train my disciple Elisha, which is different than Elijah, to take my place. And I got to tell you, I can't stand this guy. I mean, all this is in the Bible. All he does is babble. He's terrible. And Elijah really opens up to God. He says, I want to have a life like everybody else. I want to have a wife. I served you for so many years. And God, in Judaism, God is not defined as a male. He's defined as male and female. And also, in the Bible, the angels are Aphrodites. They are female from the neck up, and they're male from the neck down. So that's the reason why you never see an angel that appears and he's got a beard, because they have feminine voices. The voice of an angel is a bat kol. It's a feminine voice. So there's this duality in religion. So getting back to the story of Elijah, God says, and this is the reason why I said it, it's almost like in a female characteristic. I'm really ticked off at you, okay? And therefore, I want to make an example of you. You know, I'm internal, and I'm so upset with you that I'm going to send you off on a fiery chariot so everybody can see that you're leaving this world before your time, and you're not going to come back until the end of time. I am not going to bring you back until there's no more universe or world. I am so upset with you, you are going to not come back until there's another order here on earth, okay? Until something changes, but it's not going to be under my regime, you know? And this is where so-called the belief in the Messiah comes, that someday when the Messiah comes, since a new world order is going to be there, Elijah's going to return. We use the word fakachta, which means crazy. We have this craziness in the Jewish religion that every time a baby is born, we remember Elijah. We sing about him. Every time Passover comes, we sing about Elijah. And every time a new week comes, we think about Elijah, because so many things came terrible happening in the world that we didn't want to face life again, that we were praying that a deliverer would come, and if Elijah comes back to life, it means that deliverer is going to be here. Now, I know I'm jumping all over the place, but it's very interesting that during the first century, you have Alexandria, you have Pompeii, you have Rome, and you have Jerusalem, or either all the city is completely destroyed or there's a great fire, and it looks like the world is ending. And the average person during the Roman times lived to age 10. If you believed in this idea of reincarnation or regeneration, that your soul is going to come back to life again, and it's going to suffer right now the way it did in the last life, who would want to go there? Okay? So this whole belief in resurrection and in reward in heaven, it's almost like the Jews that died during the Holocaust. A lot of them went to their death thinking that where they were going had to be a better place than they were going to stay in, because times were so painful, right? So there was this hope or this belief that wherever the soul is going, it's going to be in a better place, right? So again, getting back to what the definition of the soul is. The soul is ruled by 4 different things. It's ruled by energy because it's comprised mostly of energy, okay? And there are 3 parts of the soul. You have the breath, you have the spirit, and you have the soul's essence, okay? Now, in Christianity, you have this belief in the Holy Spirit, okay? That's exactly what the Ruach is, okay? The Holy Spirit occurs in the Bible. You know, the one thing Judaism believes in is that God is here and man is here. There's a definite division between what God is and what man is not. Man is not eternal, okay? Man is different than God. God is infinite, man is finite. What bridges the gap between man and God is the existence of the soul. Now if we go back to Philo, Philo defines life is that man is different than the animal. He's different than the angels because man has a soul. If you go back to the creation of man, God's talking to the angels in Genesis, and he says, let us make man in our image, okay? So, and then it says, in the image of God, man was created. So now we have to go into the idea of what the word image means. The word image in Judaism doesn't mean a physical image, it means in God's imagination. And God's image of man is that he's going to make man to be a partner in God's creation. Okay? So God signed all of us with his name. You know, how many people, in Judaism we name people after the deceased, but I know in other Western traditions we name man after like their father, like we have Joe Jr., you know. God loves man more than he loves anybody else. So what he does is that God's name, the so-called Jehovah God, has it's the number 26. It's the number 26. This is where we get into the Hebrew now, and I know it might be a little confusing, but the word love, you know that even in the New Testament, we take 620 commandments into 2, that, you know, you have to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might, and you have to love your neighbor as yourself. If God is love, the number for love in Hebrew is 13, and 13 times 2 is the way to God. You get to God by loving yourself and loving other people, okay? It's the only, and then it says in Genesis 1:26, God made man in his own image. It's God's name. Now, the interesting thing about the Jewish religion, which is based on law, you only show love by what you do. One of the things that differentiates Judaism from other religions is that the word love, the word Israel, and God, the word for God, are all verbs. They're not nouns. They're all forms of energy. Love is not what you feel, it's what you do. Okay? You show your love by your actions. And so there in Judaism there are 620 actions, okay? Jews put a mezuzah on their door, and if you take your 3 fingers in the center of your hand, it's the number shin is the number 300. So you have 300 on this hand, you have 300 on this hand, and if you take your thumb and put it into your pinky, it's a yud. You know, like the word chai. Chai is a composite of 8 plus 10. His life is 18. So the number 10 is yud. So you have 620 commandments. That's why there's 620 commandments in the Jewish religion, because everything you do with your hands. okay? You can't think in action. You have to do in action. I don't care if you give money, if you help a friend, everything you do physically. So in Judaism, for every prayer, and the word prayer means to fall into godliness in Hebrew, for every prayer, there is an action that you have to do. Okay, so you can't live your life without any actions. The difference is that the soul is spiritual and the body is physical. So the soul needs the body and the body needs the soul. It works hand in hand. But the difference between Judaism and Christianity is that the soul is separate from the body. So in Jewish belief that when a person dies, the body is, if you're cremated, if you're buried, the body returns to the earth as it was given and the soul goes to heaven. But the body never physically goes to heaven. I mean, that is the traditional belief in Judaism today. And we name people after the dead with the thought that those people's soul are coming back regenerated or reincarnated into another body. Okay, the reason why a lot of people started believing in the resurrection and the coming of the Messiah is that it's quite ridiculous that, you know, the Jews were slaves for 400 years in Egypt. Roman occupation is so terrible. Who would want to come back again? It's just pain living in this world. We would just rather stay in a place called heaven, which is like a resting stop. And I'll define heaven a little more later in my talk. But what I want to get to now, because I'm being cognizant of time here as well, is that your body takes up space and it's composed of matter and the energy makes it come alive, okay? Now I'm going to deal with the fascination of time and tell you why the burning bush didn't burn. In heaven, there is no time. God is all around us, okay? In heaven, there is no time. The soul never ages. These are all according to philosophy, Jewish philosophy or the teachings of Philo. So you can say to me, well, Rabbi Marc, why don't we read all about this? This is another quirk of history. Most of what Philo wrote was all destroyed. When Cleopatra was queen of Egypt, there was a great fire in Alexandria, and most of the writings of Philo were, like 90% of them were totally destroyed. And we only have his teachings that were passed down through oral tradition that other people would write about him. But he was a great teacher, and that's where the word philosophy comes from. There was the school of the teachings about Philo. Philo not only changed Judaism, but he changed Christianity as well, because this is where the concept of where the soul comes from. If you go back to the soul, there are really three parts of the soul. You are very cognizant, if you ever go through meditation, and you ever want to get away from the world, you might want to go to your favorite place, and you might want to think, and you don't want to think about what the world is around you, and you're only thinking of who you are, and you just shut out the rest of the world. And a lot of people are able to do that, okay? Now, there are times where people read scripture or where they are so into what they are into that they penetrate to the next level of the soul where they reach the so-called Holy Spirit, or they have communion with the essence of life. The joy gives them so much pleasure that they can see these divine lights, or they have this feeling of ecstasy that they are in a spiritual place now. I don't care if it's at a retreat, I don't care if it's at nature, whatever it is where your mind is taking you, your mind is no longer aware that it's in its body, and you're no longer aware of time, and you're not aware of your other problems or your other hopes or your traditions. You're only within yourself, and you're in a happy place. There are people who've got there through drinking, they've got there through whatever has taken them through to that place. They are in a different place, and a lot of people just don't want to be in the place that they're at because they find that there is pain, or that they want to, it goes beyond pleasure. They really want to be in a happy place. They really want to find the word joy. Now, joy in Hebrew is different than happiness. Joy means something that you have to create, okay? I can give you something and it can make you happy. But if something's going to make you full of joy or joyful, it's something that you have to create. You have to work to get joy. In Hebrew, that's just the way it is. In English, maybe happiness and joy are two different things, but you can't get joy in going to the movies. You know, seeing a good movie can make you happy, but it's not going to make you joyful. You know, raising a child, being in a marriage, finding your soulmate, that can make you joyful. And, you know, the word joy is used in the Bible, and we use it the word rejoice. And you know what that means? It means you lost your joy, and now you want to get it back again. You know, the psalmist says, this is the day the world has made, you know, rejoice and be happy. So rejoice means you have to find something pleasurable in the day that gives you joy, okay? And, you know, a lot of people can never get to the second step, right? To get to the third step of your neshama, your true soul's essence, is really where you find your meaning in life. You have to find your meaning in life and, you know, why you were here. You know, the question really is that life is a gift that God gives you. What have you given back to life? You have to find your meaning in life. Unfortunately, a lot of people think that meaning in life means worldly assets. It means pleasure. It means, you know, money. It could mean land. It could mean power. It could mean multiple marriages. You know, King Solomon had all of these things. And when he wrote the book of Ecclesiastes, he said, vanity of vanities, all life is vanity. Because no matter, I have 1,000 wives, I've got all of these palaces, I've got everything that my kingdom can give me, and I still haven't found peace. So now we get to the words that you know and use all the time, you don't really understand their meaning. I told you about the word mazel tov. That's not the most common Hebrew word. What's the most common Hebrew word? Shalom. And the word means peace. And the word peace, again, is mistranslated. It doesn't mean what it means in English. The word peace means, it comes from the Hebrew word lishalem, which means to be complete. You're only complete when you are satisfied with your portion in life. For some reason, and I went through the 13 attributes of Maimonides. In those 13 attributes, we never said that God was perfect. You have to understand, in heaven there isn't peace. Even by Christian definition, even though Jews don't believe in Satan, a third of the angels rebelled against God. Okay? So the angels aren't happy with God. According to Judaism, they're not happy in the idea that God gave man free will, but he didn't give the angels free will. Okay? He gave them the pleasure of leading a life, but in heaven, the angels can't live a life. They don't have any corporal being, and they don't have any pleasure. They simply have to serve God. And you know, one of the things they know, none of the other rabbis, none of the other priests, none of the other ministers will tell you. But go home tonight and read chapter 6 of Genesis, verses 1 through 3. The angels are so upset with God. Remember when we were campers and we used to sneak out and go into the kitchen like when we were 6 years old to get the cookies and raid and come back because we were hungry? The angels actually go down and they fornicate with the women, and they want to have families. And this is where the fallen angels come from, and where the giants come from. And the last of the giants was Goliath. And David defeated Goliath. He was the last of the angels. And what made God the most angry in the entire Bible was the fact that man didn't eat from the fruit, but actually the angels came down and they fornicated with the women, and God's total disorder was set up. And God said that someday if a Messiah would come and save the world, it would have to be from the seed of David, because he was the one that slew the giant Goliath. Okay, and that's why the Messiah comes from the seed of David. Fascinating story. David is the only person in the Bible that we know anything about physically. And I had to read the Bible several times, and I realized it said that David had red hair. We know nothing else what about any other person looked like physically, but we know that David had red hair. At the time, I guess red hair was very, very rare. But, here was a child of 10 that slew the giant, and when he did so, he said, I do this for God and I do it for Israel. He didn't say, I do it to be king. He didn't say, I do it for myself. But if you think about that and you read the story of David and Goliath, when the 5 stones hit the forehead of Goliath, they did not bounce off, but they sunk into Goliath, because they write about 5 smooth stones that had some type of spiritual essence that were able to defeat this giant. So the Bible gets very mystical and it gets very spiritual. And now we talk about, life after life. It becomes very, very complex, because in this life after life, we have the players. We have the angels, we have God, we have people who are not angels, who never make it to heaven. And I want to talk more about that. They are so-called the ghosts that we have. I don't like going to cemeteries. I think there's negative energy there. I think that there are a lot of people that never make it to heaven because you don't realize it again, but when somebody dies, everybody says, may they rest in peace. There we go again with the word peace. Meaning rest in peace means is that hopefully when they died, they cleared up and they have closure on all the matters that they had in the land of the living. If your mind is still on the living, your mind isn't going to get where it's going to be to the next place. So, that's the reason why even in Judaism and in Catholicism and in other religions, there are so-called last rites where people want to confess their sins. They want their souls to be clean when they face God. So now here we come to the judgment day. So what happens when you die according to, Rabbi Marc or to Judaism? The soul, which has its own separate court, goes to the angel of death, or it goes to wherever it's going to find out whether or not it's going to get into the pearly white gates or wherever its resting place is going to be. And 3 questions, according to the rabbis and according to Philo, are going to have to be answered. And they're difficult questions. They're very easy questions to answer, but they're very difficult when you think about them. What have you contributed to life? Okay, and there are a lot of people who don't live, if they live on the pleasure principle or assets, how many lives have you affected? What good deeds have you done? How have you contributed to life? You lived so many years, and what have you done with those years? It's not how many years you lived, but what have you done with the years that you have lived that are important? Did you do good things or bad things? And how you answer those questions, that's going to determine where your soul is going to go. The second thing is that what did you learn? A lot of people are mystified by that one also, because basically your life isn't about you, it's about your soul's life. Basically, you are in your body because your soul had something to learn. And if your soul didn't learn what it's supposed to learn, you're going to repeat the same mistakes in your next life that you had in this life until you get it right. And the third thing is, what did you enjoy most in life? What did you enjoy about it? And a lot of people, all they do is kvetch, all they do is complain. They don't look at what they have good, and God's going to say, you weren't grateful. It's your attitude and your gratitude that matters. You see people pray before they eat. You see people thanking God for what they have. But a lot of times when they pray, it's not for what they have, but for what they don't have. How many people complain about the missing tile syndrome? We can do so many good things in our life, but we only complain about the things that went wrong and never about what we achieved. And you don't learn anything from your successes, you only learn from your mistakes. So the interesting thing about the Jewish people and why they've continued to exist is because they never believed the garbage that people said about them. They never played the victim. They never looked upon their mistakes and their failures. And they always lived on hope that wherever they were going was going to be a better place for them and for their children. So the soul is really the core of who you are, not only when you die, but when you were alive. And in Judaism, we believe in past lives, and we believe in future lives. There are a few Jews, and they tend to be Orthodox, that believe in the resurrection of the dead and the coming of the Messiah. Okay, I personally do not, because the word Messiah appears in the Bible, but the word the Messiah never appears. A deliverer can be several people in different eras of our life. It doesn't have to be exclusively just one individual. And according to Philo, heaven is not a physical place, it is a spiritual place where angels are. And what do angels do all day? They pray and they learn. So if you ask me what heaven is in the Jewish religion, it's not a place where you go and play golf or you have a mansion, and you believe in foodism where you eat, but it's a place where you study and you pray, and it's your attitude and your gratitude. It's really interesting that if you take the word attitude, where A is number 1 and B is number 2 and C is number 3, it equals the word 100. Try it out. Write all the letters of the alphabet out, all of them, and then add up all those letters, where T is at 19 and I might be 9 or 10, and you'll come up with the word 100. And again, if 1% is in doubt, then you're not 100% with it. And this is really where we have to be in life. That the name Israel, which again is a verb because we're constantly in a state of becoming, you have to, in some way, grapple with your problems. Have you ever met somebody in life without any trouble? The word trouble in Hebrew is in the plural, okay? Everybody has more than one trouble. And when we look at where we are in our life and our life expectancy with all the people that preceded us, we're in a pretty good place, aren't we? So really, it's really attitude and gratitude. Basically, it's very interesting. If you go back to what I was saying about, I was born in the month of November, and technically your soul has a horoscope, so that when it goes back to what we call the guff, the storehouse of souls, and an angel of birth says, like you're going to get out of the dugout of heaven and go back to the earth, and you're going to go into a female's womb and sit for 9 months and come back into the earth and be born. You're going to be born in the same month that you were born in a previous life. Because there are certain people with certain personalities. People are dominant, people are passive, people are escapists, people are in some way, expressive in their personalities. And there are two things that I can't relate to, that I still struggle with in all my years of being a rabbi and all my years of learning. But I have to accept it. Is why there's evil in the world and why there's pain. Okay, but there is. And basically you can say, well, what happens to an evil person is that an evil person goes into that phantom zone where God does not renew that person's life again. For whatever reasons that person is evil, that person's soul does not get a pass to come back to earth again. And why there's pain in this life, God explains that very easily, even though I don't accept God's explanation, is that if you find this life painful, you'll have another life. How many of you had a bad meal? You eat 3 of them a day, and you might eat 1,000 meals a year or more, and if you had one bad meal, so what? Your soul is going to come back again, and your soul was there to learn. And that's how we explain, the existence of the soul. So I've been through a lot of places here, and I hope that you have some type of clarity what Judaism has to say about the existence of the soul. But the main thing I want you to know is that where Judaism remains unique is that the soul is separate completely from the body. So that it's when you die, you really shouldn't be cognizant or concerned about what happens with your remains because it's not you. You know, everybody says, what did they do with the body? They never refer to the person anymore. The person is with God. The soul is completely separate from the body. It's very difficult in Judaism because none of the rabbis can actually promise another congregant that you're going to be reunited with past loved ones, that you're going to have a home or you're going to have some place to live with loved ones who you cared about in this life. I will end and then I will take questions. In Judaism, it's much more important about what you're leaving behind than where you're going. And it's troubling for me that you don't even carry your memories with you to heaven because your soul is completely recycled. I have no awareness of my past life or what my future life is going to be. I can only be concerned with what I leave behind. It's the legacy, those who I have affected and those who I have taught. When I was in my 60s and became really aware of my own mortality and that there was more life behind me than ahead of me, I decided to write 2 books. And now I'm very aware too about, the days left ahead of me as we age, that, that everything is in order when I do pass someday, long into the future. Because I truly believe that those people who are troubled never make it to heaven. If that's anything that I can tell you. Again, I go back to the physicality of this. I had a bad experience down in South America years ago. I came back with a parasitic infection, and that was because I did a wedding on Machu Picchu. Why I did this, I don't realize, but it was at a site where they had practiced human sacrifice. The Peruvians were very, very nice people, but they practiced human sacrifice down there. And whether it was negative energy that I brought back or whether it was parasites, I don't know. But I take these magnesium baths every week when I go to my holistic doctor. And every time I go to a cemetery, I go into a hospital where people pass, the water is black the next day. Because I know that the reason why I refused to go to the concentration camps and back to Nazi Germany or Germany where so many people lost their lives, it's very unfortunate that a lot of people, it wasn't dying in fear, but it was the fact that there was such negativity about where they died, and you're combining the place, the people, and the event and the time that I don't want to have any negative emotions in my life. I don't want to be around negative people. How many times I know I go to a synagogue down in Carlsbad, and when I go there as a visitor, there's so much positive energy there. I just don't want to leave the people. And I think that that's what you really should do with your life. You should fill your life with positive energy. Because life defined by Philo and by the Jewish mystics is full of positive and negative. You see it in Christianity. Judaism doesn't believe in the devil, but it believes in negativity and negative, emotions. And I don't want to surround myself with negative emotions. And unfortunately, people have time. Time is the one thing that you have. It doesn't cost anything, but you can't squander time. And on that, I'm sure you have lots of questions here because I've covered a great deal of